He was a man loved by many but truly known by none. A devoted husband, a doting father, at least, that's what everyone believed. But behind closed doors, Javarius Bellamy was living a double life. A father to 27 children, a manipulator of 16 different women, and a predator hiding in plain sight. For years, he spun a web of lies so intricately woven that not even his own wife knew the truth. But secrets don't stay buried forever, and when the truth finally came out, the nightmare that followed would shock the entire nation. How does a life so carefully constructed collapse so catastrophically? How does a betrayal so profound drive someone to the point of no return? This is the story of love, deception, and a crime so horrifying that no one saw it coming. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping case, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales of deception, betrayal, and murder. Javarius Bellamy was the kind of man who could walk into any room and command attention. At 45, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had it all figured out. To his friends, he was known as J-Rock, a smooth talker, street-savvy, always with a fresh pair of sneakers and a knowing grin. But behind the charm was something far more sinister. Javarius wasn't just a ladies' man. He was a master manipulator, a man who prided himself on living off the backs of hard-working women while contributing nothing in return. For the past 15 years, his wife, Satoria Nichols-Bellamy, had been the foundation of their household. A devoted nurse, she worked endless shifts, pulling double and sometimes even triple duty to make sure her family was provided for. At 38, Satoria believed she was holding down a struggling man, one who just needed a little support to get back on his feet. She had given him 2 children, a home, and unwavering loyalty, never realizing that she was just one of 16 women trapped in the same lie. To their neighbors, they were a regular couple. Satoria, always exhausted but determined, and Javarius, the man who never seemed to catch a break. If anyone ever questioned why a grown man never had a job, why he always seemed to be working on something big, but never had anything to show for it, Satoria was the first to defend him. "He's trying," she would say, "he just needs time." But time was the one thing Javarius never seemed to run out of. While Satoria was clocking into another grueling shift at the hospital, Javarius was playing a different game entirely. In another part of town, he was whispering the same sweet lies into another woman's ear. Promises of forever, of building a future together. And when that woman got pregnant, just like the 15 before her, Javarius disappeared. Always moving, always scheming, never looking back. He had it down to a science, telling each woman exactly what she needed to hear, making them believe they were the only one. He never stayed long enough for questions. Never got too comfortable. And when the pressure of fatherhood crept too close, he did what he did best, he vanished. But what happens when a secret this big can no longer be contained? How long can one man juggle 16 different lives before everything comes crashing down? For years, Javarius played the game effortlessly. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, and when it did, it came with a vengeance no one saw coming. For years, Javarius Bellamy lived like a ghost, slipping in and out of lives with practiced ease, leaving behind nothing but heartbreak and fatherless children. He was a man who never stayed long enough to face the consequences of his actions. A drifter with no real job, no real future, just a talent for seduction and an addiction to control. 15 women, 15 different versions of the same story. He found them at their weakest, their loneliest, their most desperate. He promised love. A future. Stability. And they believed him because that's what he made them do. But once the test turned positive, once the weight of responsibility became too real, Javarius became a ghost. He told some he was chasing a business deal that would change their lives, others that he had family obligations, or that he was working on himself. Excuses as empty as his promises. And the worst part? None of the women knew about each other. Each of them believed they were his only family. But secrets like this don't stay buried forever. For Satoria, life was already hard enough. She worked herself to the bone as a nurse, taking extra shifts to cover bills that Javarius never helped with. But she never questioned it. She had convinced herself that she was just supporting a good man through a rough patch. If she just held on a little longer, if she just worked a little harder, he would eventually step up. She had no idea that while she was at the hospital saving lives, her own home had become a nightmare. It started with Tiana. Her 16-year-old daughter had always been bright, full of life. But lately, something had changed. She was quieter. More withdrawn. She stopped going out with friends, stopped looking people in the eye. Satoria thought maybe it was just teenage mood swings, maybe school stress. Until the morning Tiana collapsed in the kitchen. The hospital visit started with routine questions. Had she been eating enough? Drinking enough water? The doctor asked when her last period was. Tiana hesitated. And that was when Satoria's stomach clenched with an unease she couldn't explain. The blood work confirmed it, Tiana was pregnant. 4 months. Satoria's world tilted. She sat there in disbelief, the beeping of the hospital monitors suddenly too loud, too sharp. A baby. Her baby was having a baby. The questions spilled from her lips before she could stop them. Who? When? How? But Tiana wouldn't look at her. She just sat there, silent, tears rolling down her cheeks. Then came the DNA test. A precaution, the doctor had said. A necessary step. Satoria agreed because she needed answers, needed to know which boy had done this to her daughter. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The results shattered her world. The father of Tiana's baby was not a classmate. Not some teenage boy fumbling through his first relationship. The father was a man Satoria had shared a bed with for 15 years. The man she had sworn to love and honor. The man she had sacrificed everything for. Javarius Bellamy. She couldn't breathe. It felt like her chest had caved in, like the walls were closing around her. Her mind rejected it, refused to believe it. This had to be a mistake. But then she turned to her daughter, and the look in Tiana's eyes told her everything. Tiana broke down, sobs racking her small frame, and finally, the truth spilled out. Javarius had been coming into her room at night while Satoria was working long shifts. It started with whispers. Empty reassurances. Threats that no one would believe her if she told. And then, it became something worse. Something unspeakable. The floor felt like it had been ripped out from under Satoria. Her blood turned to ice, her vision blurred. She had spent years breaking her back to support this man, believing in him, defending him. And all the while, he had been preying on their child. Her hands clenched into fists as rage and horror intertwined in her veins. The man she had loved, the man she had devoted her life to, wasn't just a liar, a user, a manipulator. He was a monster. And he had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. That night, Satoria lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She had barely spoken since leaving the hospital. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, like a graveyard filled with ghosts of the life she thought she had. Javarius was already asleep beside her, snoring lightly, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. She turned her head, staring at the man who had shattered her world. The man she had loved. The man she had trusted. A predator. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The rage, the betrayal, the disgust, it was all consuming. But she needed proof. Slowly, carefully, she reached for his phone, lying face up on the nightstand. She knew his passcode, but she didn't need it. Pressing his limp thumb against the screen, she unlocked it with ease. The screen lit up. Messages. Notifications. Missed calls. And then, the horror began. Texts from multiple women, each speaking to him like they were his only one. I love you, baby. Why haven't you been home? Javarius, our son is sick, and you're ignoring me. I swear if you don't send that money, I'm taking you to court. She scrolled faster, her hands shaking. Birth certificates. Children she never even knew existed. 15 different women, 15 different lives he had ruined. Each of them raising his child alone, waiting for a man who never planned to stay. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision blurred with hot, stinging tears. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just deception. This was a life built entirely on lies. Then she saw something that made her stomach churn. A text to Tiana. You better not say a damn word. If your mama finds out, I swear on everything, I'll make you regret it. Satoria's body went rigid. The screen nearly slipped from her fingers. The words replayed in her mind, over and over, until all she could hear was her own blood roaring in her ears. She had to do something. And she had to do it now. The next day, while Javarius went about his routine, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse, Satoria took action. She started tracking down the other women, one by one. She created a fake identity, pretending to be a private investigator working on a case. She sent messages, carefully crafted, inviting several of them to her home under the pretense of discussing child support and financial compensation. One by one, they responded. Some hesitant, others eager. But all of them wanted answers. And that evening, Javarius walked into the trap of a lifetime. He strolled through the front door, expecting a quiet night, maybe even a meal waiting for him on the table. Instead, he froze. Seated at the dining table were 6 of his other baby mothers. Women he had spent years lying to, manipulating, stringing along. Women who had no idea that they weren't the only ones. And standing at the head of the table, with her arms crossed and a look of pure fury in her eyes, was Satoria. Javarius blinked, confusion spreading across his face. What the hell is this? He muttered, his voice losing its usual bravado. No one answered at first. The air was thick, suffocating. The women exchanged glances, uncertain, waiting for someone to break the silence. And then Satoria spoke. I know everything. She tossed his phone onto the table. The screen was still lit, displaying the endless messages, the birth certificates, the damning evidence of his double life. The room erupted. Women gasped. Some screamed in shock. Others covered their mouths, shaking their heads in disbelief. You have how many kids? One of them shrieked. Are you serious right now? Another demanded. You told me I was the only one. I thought you were in jail all those times you disappeared. You told me you were working. The voices overlapped, growing louder, angrier, more desperate. Some had no idea he had other children. Others thought they were his only woman. But the moment the worst truth came out, the room fell into a chilling silence. Satoria stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out a single piece of paper. A DNA test. This, she said, her voice breaking, is your child. Your 16-year-old daughter's child. All the color drained from Javarius' face. The women stared in horror as Satoria's words settled in. His own daughter. The baby wasn't just another affair. It was the result of something unspeakable. The silence shattered as one of the women lunged at him. You sick bastard, she screamed, shoving him so hard he nearly lost his balance. Another woman sobbed into her hands. Oh my God. I let you around my kids. Javarius tried to speak, tried to salvage the situation. His lips curled into the same slick, manipulative smile that had worked 1,000 times before. Now, hold up. I don't know what kind of lies Satoria is feeding y'all, but this is crazy. He forced a laugh, looking around the room like he expected someone to back him up. No one did. Satoria didn't even blink. "You're a liar," she said, her voice sharp as glass. She picked up the DNA test and threw it in his face. The paper fluttered to the floor, landing at his feet. And in that moment, he realized there was no way out. For the first time in his life, Javarius Bellamy had nowhere to run. The room was chaos. Women screamed, cursed, lunged at him, some with fists raised, others too stunned to move. Years of betrayal, humiliation, and rage boiled over in an instant. Javarius tried to back away, his hands raised as if that could stop the wrath coming for him. "Satoria, baby, listen. Don't you dare say my name," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. She shoved him hard, sending him stumbling back against the table. The other women circled like wolves, their faces twisted in fury and disgust. One woman, a tall, dark-skinned beauty with tear-streaked cheeks, spit directly into his face. "You sick piece of trash," she screamed. "I let you hold my son. I let you in my house. You were playing daddy while you were raping your own daughter." Another woman, Keisha, threw a punch, landing square on his jaw. Javarius grunted, staggering from the impact. He wasn't the slick-talking, womanizing charmer anymore. He was just a cornered man, hunted and helpless. Satoria didn't even feel the ground beneath her feet anymore. Everything inside her was burning. This wasn't just about cheating. It wasn't just about lies. He had destroyed lives. He had preyed on their daughters. He had used their bodies, their homes, and their love as stepping stones to a never-ending game of deception. And he had done the unthinkable to her child. Javarius wiped the spit from his face, looking around wildly. He could see it in their eyes now. They weren't just angry. They wanted blood. "I swear, y'all trippin'," he tried, his voice breaking as he backed away. "I ain't raped nobody, Tiana lying." Crack. A glass bottle shattered against the side of his head. The blow sent him sprawling onto the floor, his hands clutching at his scalp, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood dripped from a fresh wound, trickling down his forehead. Satoria hadn't even realized she was the one who threw it until she saw the shards at her feet. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, erratic bursts. Her entire body was trembling. Javarius groaned, rolling onto his side. He was still trying to talk, still trying to lie. Satoria stepped over to him. She pulled something from the waistband of her jeans. A gun. The women fell silent. Even the ones who had been screaming stopped. The only sound was the ragged, choking breaths coming from the man on the floor. Javarius' eyes flickered up, landing on the gun, then on her face. He licked his lips, his breath shaking. "Now, Satoria, baby, we don't gotta do this." The sound of her name coming from his mouth made her stomach turn. "You touched my child." He shook his head violently. "She lying." Bang. The gunshot tore through his stomach, making his body jolt. A strangled scream ripped from his throat as he clutched at the wound, his fingers slick with his own blood. His legs kicked out involuntarily, his body writhing on the floor. The room stayed still. The only thing moving was him, dying. Satoria didn't lower the gun. She watched as he struggled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the floor in thick, crimson rivers. And yet, it still wasn't enough. She put the gun down and turned toward the kitchen counter. The women watched in frozen horror as she grabbed the biggest knife from the wooden block. Javarius was still groaning, his eyes rolling back, his body convulsing. He looked up at her, blood dripping from his lips. "Satoria, please." She tilted her head, her grip tightening on the handle. "Now you wanna beg?" He tried to scoot backward, but his body was failing him. He had lost too much blood. He was weak. "Good. Satoria kneeled over him, pressed the blade to his throat, and slashed. The first cut was deep, but not enough. Javarius gurgled, his eyes going wide, his body twitching violently. Blood sprayed from his neck, coating her hands, her shirt, her face. She did it again. And again. His throat opened like a second mouth, a jagged, wet gash. His body convulsed one last time before going completely still. The only sound in the room was the dripping of blood pooling around them. But Satoria wasn't done. She stared at him, her breath coming in short, manic gasps. His pants. Her fingers moved before she could even process the thought. She yanked down his waistband, her blood-soaked hands shaking as she grabbed what was once the source of his power. The weapon he had used to destroy lives. The knife plunged down. Once. Twice. 3 times. Until it was free. Until he was nothing. Satoria sat back, her body trembling, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She looked down at what she had severed. Her lips curled into something twisted, something neither a smile nor a sob. And then, with slow, deliberate movements, she shoved the severed flesh into his open mouth. Javarius Bellamy, the man who had lied, manipulated, cheated, and destroyed, had died choking on the very thing that had controlled his entire life. The women in the room didn't speak. Some had turned away, covering their mouths, too shocked to move. Others stared, eyes wide, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Satoria wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing blood across her cheek. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she exhaled. Now he can't hurt nobody else. The house was in chaos. Screams filled the air, piercing, raw, primal. The women who had moments ago stood in that room, furious, betrayed, seething with rage, were now running for their lives. One stumbled over a chair, shrieking as she scrambled to her feet. Another clawed at the front door, wrenching it open so hard it nearly came off the hinges. Their cries echoed through the neighborhood, the sound of their panic carrying into the night. Blood was everywhere. It coated the floor, the walls, the furniture. And at the center of it all sat Satoria. She didn't move. Didn't flinch as the chaos erupted around her. Didn't react to the distant wails of sirens growing closer, closer, until the flashing red and blue lights painted the street outside. She just sat there, her hands resting on the table, drenched in deep, crimson red. Javarius' body lay motionless at her feet, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, his mouth stuffed with the mutilated evidence of his own sins. His vacant eyes stared at the ceiling, frozen in the final moment of horror. And Satoria? Neighbors called the police after hearing 2 gunshots. When the SWAT team stormed in, their boots pounding against the hardwood floor, rifles forcing her onto the ground. Her face pressed into the blood-soaked floor, and yet, she remained eerily calm. It wasn't until they dragged her out of the house, past the crowd of horrified neighbors, the flashing cameras, the flashing lights, that she finally spoke. She lifted her head, looked directly at a reporter shoving a microphone in her face, and in a voice eerily steady, she said, "I did what needed to be done." The news exploded like wildfire. Javarius Bellamy was no longer just a drifter, a womanizer, a con artist. His name became a scandal, a horror story, a cautionary tale. A man with 27 children by 16 different women, brutally murdered by his wife. The media devoured the story. Some outlets called it the ultimate betrayal, a woman pushed past her breaking point, exacting her own twisted form of justice. Others called it a mother-turned-monster, a brutal, premeditated execution disguised as revenge. Social media was divided. Some people cheered for Satoria. She did what the system would have never done. He raped his own daughter. He got what he deserved. Others condemned her. Murder is murder. She set him up. This wasn't justice, it was bloodlust. The debate raged on. But one fact remained: Javarius Bellamy was dead. And Satoria Nichols-Bellamy was facing a murder charge. The trial began 6 months later. Courtroom packed. Cameras everywhere. News outlets broadcasting every moment. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer. She didn't just kill him, she lured him into a trap. She orchestrated this entire confrontation knowing exactly how it would end. They displayed the autopsy photos, the brutal stab wounds, the severed flesh, the horrific final image of him lying with his own genitals shoved down his throat. The jury winced. The spectators gasped. It was the kind of violence people only saw in nightmares. The defense, on the other hand, painted a different picture. This was not a premeditated murder. This was a woman who had just discovered her husband was not only a predator, but he had violated her child. A mother who had been pushed past every imaginable breaking point. They presented Tayana's testimony. The entire courtroom fell silent as the 16-year-old took the stand, her hands trembling, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me if I ever said anything, nobody would believe me. He said he was my father, and that meant he could do whatever he wanted. Tears slid down her cheeks as she recounted the years of abuse. The way he would creep into her room when Satoria was working late shifts, the way he would cover her mouth when she tried to scream. The way he had made her feel like she was nothing. Even the judge had to take a moment to regain his composure. But the prosecution fought back. This trial is not about Javarius Bellamy's crimes. It is about Satoria Nichols-Bellamy's actions. She had choices. She could have called the police. She could have walked away. Instead, she planned his death and executed it in a fit of rage. The jury deliberated for 2 days. And when they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty of first-degree murder. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Satoria didn't flinch, the judge's voice rang out like a hammer. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some in the crowd cheered for justice. Others wept for a mother who had lost everything. Satoria didn't react. She simply turned her head, found Tayana's tear-filled eyes in the crowd, and gave her a small, sad smile. And then she was led away, shackles around her wrists, disappearing through the courtroom doors. Forever. This case is not just about a murder. It's about betrayal, deception, and the slow, simmering rage that turned into an unstoppable inferno. Javarius Bellamy lived a life built on lies, a man who manipulated, deceived, and took from the women who trusted him. He played with fire for years, thinking he could always talk his way out of the consequences. But on that fateful night, there was no escape. The women he had wronged stood before him, demanding answers, demanding justice. And when the truth was finally dragged into the light, the weight of it was too much to bear. What happened that night wasn't just a crime, it was an eruption. A breaking point. A moment where years of pain and anger collided with the undeniable, monstrous reality of what he had done. Satoria Nichols-Bellamy pulled the trigger, but the question that lingers is, was she truly a cold-blooded killer, or was she a mother who had finally been pushed too far? If Javarius had been exposed sooner, if the women in his life had known what he was capable of before it was too late, could this tragedy have been avoided? Or was it always destined to end this way? These are the questions that haunt this case, that divide public opinion, that make it one of the most shocking and unforgettable crimes in recent history. If this story shocked you, if it made you think twice about the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal, make sure to like and subscribe for more cases that uncover the hidden horrors behind seemingly ordinary lives.